Now, I've interviewed this brilliant Israeli Jewish politician before, Ofer Cassif. He's a very courageous individual who I'm afraid, rarely amongst fellow members of the Israeli Knesset has used his platform to speak out against the horrors being perpetrated against the Palestinian people, with, of course, the direct complicity and facilitation of our own governments here in the West. And he has been forced to pay a price. And what we're going to talk about today, not least given Israel styles itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, notwithstanding the occupation of the Palestinian people, a form of despotism, which itself is a disqualifier, of course, for any self-styled democracy, the space for basic democratic rights within Israel in its pre-1967 borders is diminishing. And it's worth talking about that. The ability to dissent, to speak out, to criticize, not least the occupation and the abominations being perpetrated, is shrinking. Now, Ofer Cassif, as I've said, is a parliamentarian, but action has been taken against him. We'll talk about that. Ofer, I should say, maybe for some of my listeners, a relief. I'm having to speak more slowly and loudly because we had a bit of a tech issue. So Ofer needs to be able to hear me properly. I speak too fast anyway, so a lot of viewers are going to be very relieved that this tech mishap has happened. Ofer, can you just explain what action has been taken against you and why?
Well, there are a few actions that were taken against me and against my comrades, because the silencing and the persecution of anyone who raises an alternative voice, anyone who raises a voice, a clear voice against the genocide that goes on in Gaza and against other atrocities and crimes that Israel is guilty of against the Palestinian people, as well as against the Israeli people, by the way. So everybody has been persecuted under the guise of fighting terrorism or incitement or whatever lie you can pick. So in my case, as a member of the Knesset, I am supposed to be immune, and to have a more than basic freedom of speech, but that doesn't exist. I've been suspended now for 6 months from the Knesset, apart from voting rights. So I am entitled still to vote in the plenum and in the different committees. But apart from that, I'm totally suspended. That means that my parliamentarian activity is banned, is blocked, and I cannot actually, in practice, in the parliament, represent the values and the public that voted for us. And this is only because, as I said before, they want to silence us. There's nothing honest or lawful in this suspension of mine. It is a sheer political persecution because I've been raising my voice, and I will continue, by the way, whatever the price is, to raise my voice against those crimes committed by Israel, against, as I said, mainly the Palestinian people, but as I consider it, against the Israelis as well. The hostages, even the soldiers that are sent as cannon fodder only to, on the altar of the government's survival. So because of that, because I signed a petition in support of South African appeal to the International Court of Justice, and because I a few times used the term genocide in regard to the ongoing assault on Gaza, because of those, I've been suspended, as I said, for 6 months. And there are thousands of complaints against me, organized by fascist organizations. And I may be suspended even for more, which is in practice, by the way, impeachment. I say in practice because last February, the Knesset actually tried to impeach me. That means to kick me out of the Knesset for good. Again, it was totally unlawful, even according to the legal counselor of the Knesset and the legal counselor of the government, who opposed the attempts to impeach me, saying it was unlawful and a slippery slope, towards banning anyone who the government doesn't like. So the government and those who collaborate with it from within the opposition, unfortunately, there are many. So because they didn't succeed, they ran short in four votes. They needed 90 to impeach me. They had 86. That means more than 20 for the so-called liberal opposition. So now what the ethics committee, which consists of 4 members of the Knesset, all of them belong to the right side of the political spectrum, they voted to suspend me. But it seems that it is an impeachment in practice, even if it's not, de jure.
I mean, you actually, in that original, you mentioned the petition to expel you. You were accused of treason. I mean, when you hear that term treason used to justify expelling an elected member of the Knesset.
No, I was not formally accused in treason.
Okay.
Many people, including members of the Knesset, ministers, and others, refer to me as if I was a traitor.
Got you.
But formally, officially, that was not the, what they used in their excuses to expel me. What they actually used, if I have the time to explain, and you like me to, in 2016, a very dangerous and anti-democratic law was enacted by the Knesset, which allows a majority of the Knesset members, like I said, 90 out of 120, and there is a process that precedes it. I won't exhaust you with all the details unless you want me to. So eventually they need 90 out of 120 to impeach a member of the Knesset, provided one of 2 conditions are met. One is that member of the Knesset that is about to be expelled supported supported by deeds or words racism, which is ironic because if it was applied, I believe that 80% of the Knesset members could not be members of the Knesset. And the other is if a member of the Knesset is accused in supporting terrorism or violence against the state of Israel. Now, obviously, neither of those was relevant in my case, as the legal counselors of the government and the Knesset actually said. But they didn't care because there's no law in Israel anymore. Bad law, good law, doesn't matter. There's no law. The government violates the law on a daily basis. And so here too, they actually pursued an unlawful process. But eventually they failed, as I said, and that's what led them to the ethics committee, alternative.
In terms of the wider picture, there is legislation which is to amend what is known as the basic law of the Knesset, the Israeli legislature, which will forbid candidate lists and individual candidates from being able to stand for election if they violate 3 criteria: denying the right to exist of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, incitement to racism, and support for the armed struggle of an enemy state or of a terrorist organization against the state of Israel. Now, could you explain this, and not least how in practice these terms are used in an all-encompassing way, which will prohibit the ability of you or, for example, Palestinian citizens of Israel to be able to stand for election?
Well, you correctly, cited almost word by word the amendment to basic law, the Knesset, that was accepted 40 years ago in 1985. Now, we have to remember that Israel has no constitution, just like in Britain. But in contrast to Britain, where, there is a very long tradition of liberal and democratic, political culture since the Magna Carta, we're talking about 1,000 years. In Israel, there's none. So we could, dwell upon this issue for a long time. But basically, basic laws are supposed to be a so-called material rather than official or formal constitution, but it is not actually applied in such a way. and that's part of the coup d'etat that the government still is being, pursuing. But after this amendment was enacted, there were many appeals. I think that all in throughout those years, 40 years, every time that there are elections, some rightist organizations and parties try to or appeal to the elections committee, which consists of parties, by the way, in accordance with their size within the Knesset, to bar different parties or different candidates, individuals, from participating. To make a very long story short, the Supreme Court ruled many years ago that because the right to vote and be elected are the most basic in any democratic system, in order really to ban someone or a list or a candidate, there must be, so as the Supreme Court said, mass evidence or mass facts that show that that person or list actually are interested systematically in violating one of those conditions you mentioned before. I rule out for a second, of course, what is my opinion regarding those conditions themselves. I just take them for granted for argument's sake. So in order to, every time that there was an attempt to bar us, and me in person, in 2019, first time I was, a candidate, there was an attempt to, ban me. Of course, the elections committee supported the ban because, as I said, it consists of members of the Knesset and the majority is always with the right. But the Supreme Court revoked it based on what I just said, that there was no mass evidence to show that I supported X or objected Y. Now, there's a new bill now that is going to be passed, very soon, I guess, a matter of weeks, that will change. Now they're going to change this amendment to say that, that it is going to be entrenched into the basic law that says that it's enough if there is even one phrase once by someone from the list to ban this candidate and even the list as a whole. There are some other clauses in this bill. For instance, they're going to reduce the power of the Supreme Court to revoke such decisions that are going to be taken, as I said, by politicians, basically. So the chances, once this law passes, the chances that we are going to be barred from participating in the elections, and not only us, as Hadash, which is a Jewish-Palestinian partnership for decades, but also all Arab parties, they are going for sure to bar all of us. That means that the only democracy in the Middle East, if it wasn't so sad, I would say that is a very good joke, because Israel was never a real democracy. It was an ethnocracy because it is based. All its governments, were devoted to one or another form of Jewish supremacy. But now this government is a full-fledged fascist government, very rapidly changes the regime in Israel into a total fascist dictatorship. There's a list of bills and laws that already passed, including this week, 2 days ago, for instance. And of course, if they bar us, so it's not only that we cannot be elected, it means that 21% of the Israeli citizens, I'm not talking about the occupied territories, citizens who are Palestinians, the vast majority of them who vote for us in Arab parties will not have actually a possibility or an alternative to vote for. This is a clear dictatorship.
I mean, in terms of that Palestinian population, the fifth or so of Israel, we're talking, for those to avoid confusion for viewers and listeners, That's those within Israel's pre-1967 borders. Israel Katz, who is now the defense minister, he declared back, and I spoke about this with Gideon Levy earlier in the week, he declared in 2022, long before 7th of October, when he talked about Israel's Palestinian citizens, yesterday I warned the Arab students who are flying Palestine flags at universities. Remember 48. Remember our independence war and your Nakba. Don't stretch the rope too much. If you don't calm down, we'll teach you a lesson that won't be forgotten. I apologize, that was reported in 2022. He actually said it a few years before. He's referring to, of course, the Nakba, the catastrophe when 750,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes, 15,000 killed at the foundation of Israel. I mean, when I say that, that guy is defense minister, he used to be foreign minister. Do you worry about the direction of travel when you get the disenfranchisement of a Palestinian population within Israel itself and the sort of demagogues, anti-Palestinian racists at the top of the Israeli government?
Look, there is a connection between the genocide that goes on in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing that goes on in the West Bank under the smokescreen of the genocide in Gaza. It's very important to emphasize that in the West Bank, the Palestinians still live under occupation and ethnic cleansing goes on there. And only today it was published that there are plans to, turn the West Bank into what is now Gaza. So in addition to that, there is a process of turning Israel proper within the borders of prior to June 67 into a fascist state. All of those are connected. And they are connected to what Bezalel Smotrich, who is a bigot, a fascist, a racist, who really believes in racial, ethnic, so-called Jewish supremacy, he actually published in 2017 a plan that is called the Decisive Plan or Subjugation Plan that boils down to 3 points. One is annexation of all Palestinian occupied territories, without, of course, granting basic civil, let alone political rights to those Palestinians. That means, of course, an official apartheid regime, because in practice it already exists. Secondly, those Palestinians who are not going to accept their status as subjects rather than citizens are going to be expelled from their homeland altogether. And third, those Palestinians who are going to resist are going to be killed. Everything is very explicitly published. You can even Google and find it in English. So when the government announced almost 2 years ago that they were going to what they called pursue a judicial reform, which is a sugar-coated term to coup d'etat, they actually wanted to make Israel a fascist dictatorship that would allow it to pursue the subjugation or decisive plan easily. Once they failed, especially because the massive demonstrations within Israel against those attempts, then came the terrible criminal massacre of October 7, and we have to say that that was a criminal butchery by Hamas. Once it came, then the government of Israel has been now using it as an excuse to pursue with the very same decisive plan that failed to apply before October 7. So that shows that first, everything is connected. The attempts to revoke, and unfortunately, thus far quite successful attempts, basic civil rights within Israel, the genocide in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, are all connected under the title of the decisive plan. And we have to remember that the main, of course, target and victim is the Palestinian people, although thousands, hundreds of thousands of democratic Jews who live here and take part, like myself, in the struggle against fascism, genocide, occupation, etc., we are, of course, targeted as well. that the main victims who are targeted are the Palestinians, whether it is within Israel, or whether it is in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So everything is connected, and I must say, under the total practical and sometimes even theoretical support of the international community, mainly the United States.
Before I ask you about Gaza, just one final question about what's happening within Israel itself, because there are other laws, aren't there, clamping down on freedom of expression. For example, allowing the Israeli police to open investigations about suspicion of incitement to terrorism, which is used in an all-encompassing way without the approval of the state attorney office, for example. Legislation pushed to in academia to prevent freedom of expression there as well. We saw the banning of Al Jazeera. We saw action taken against Haaretz. Just in terms of how much do you see, just the kind of summary, I guess, of all these laws one after the other and what that means for the ability to speak out and speak the truth?
Well, this is part of what I called before the process of turning Israel into a full-fledged fascist dictatorship. There are many laws. For instance, 2 days ago, another bill was passed into a law. It passed the third reading, which means that it is a law now, that allows the police, for instance, to order citizens in Israel to be confined to their houses, for instance, who can, without any judicial process, without introducing evidence of any kind. And of course, it's going to be used not against Jewish terrorists, and unfortunately there are many, but against students, professors, artists, anyone who is, even in a minimal sense, critical of the government. When there's a huge list. There's another law that was, that passed 2 or 3 weeks ago, that against, by the way, the international law and even some prior laws within Israel that now allows to put in prison minors under the age of 14 if they are involved in terrorism, and only if they are Palestinians. So there's a huge list of laws. You mentioned correctly the war that the government has been waging on the freedom of the press. And also, another thing that is very important is the judicial system. I'm very critical, by the way, I have to say. I'm very critical of the Israeli media and judicial system. They are far from being ideal, to say the least. But still, they must be as free as possible. And the government is doing exactly the opposite. They launch a war, literally, against the freedom of the judicial system and the press. So, for instance, Israel now for a long time has no president or chair of the Supreme Court, because the Minister of Justice, which is ironic to call him like that, by the way, refuses, as against, by the way, the rules of the court itself. He refuses to nominate or to even follow the process of electing president for the Supreme Court because he has no majority. So there's no law in Israel. The government systematically, on a daily basis, literally, violates the laws of the state themselves, let alone the international law, and the rules of the courts. They do whatever they like against the law and against the rules of the Supreme Court. This is exactly what fascism and dictatorship are all about. And that's where Israel is standing now. We are not, on the road into the abyss. We are deep the abyss already, sinking in the mud down there. And I put a lot of the blame on the international community that has the power to stop it, not only the genocide, but also the crimes that the Israeli government commits against the Israeli people themselves. And the world just, again, doesn't do anything, and sometimes even supports those crimes of the government.
I'll ask you about that just at the end. There's a couple of other things I wanted to ask you. One, genocide, a word you have no problem in using. Obviously, I agree with you that this is a genocide. Now, I mean, it's interesting in Haaretz, which I mentioned, there was a report by an Israeli soldier who talks about how rules of engagement banned the shooting of stray dogs unless their jaws were clenched on the bodies of an Israeli soldier, but no rules existed to protect civilians from being shot who were being indiscriminately slaughtered and then categorized after they were killed as terrorists. I'm just wondering, what I've done all the way through this is speak to extremely courageous Israeli figures like yourself, which I'll continue to do so. And history will vindicate you for what you have said. I've got no question about that, unless we have a very dark future ahead of us. But I'm wondering, the polling has been catastrophic, I'll be honest, amongst the Jewish Israeli population. That's why the stance you're taking is so courageous. Do you detect any shift? Is there a growing number of, within Israeli society, I'm not talking about the Palestinian population, the 80% plus who are Jewish, do you see any hope that the recognition of the sheer barbarism being inflicted against the Palestinian people, that there are growing numbers of people who actually can see that for what it is? What do you think?
First of all, I want to say, and it's important for me, that when I say that the Israeli government is guilty in genocide, I do not say that, in order to say, look, I told you so 1 year ago. You see, I was right. So I'm not saying that, I'm not happy about that because I was right. I'm very sad and painful and hurt. It hurts me that the government of the state, of my state, it is my state too. And my struggle is for justice, in my view, justice is universal. So when I fight for justice, it's not for Palestinians against the Israelis or vice versa. It is for justice for all, Israelis and Palestinians alike. And part of it is to fight against the crimes that my government is guilty of in order to change my society and state to be good ones. That's part of my struggle. And because of that, it hurts me that I have to say that. But I am committed to the truth, because in order, like in medicine, in order to give the right remedy, first you have to make the right diagnosis. So same here. If we refrain from using the right terms, that is genocide, how can we stop it? And how can we change it? And how can we, heal both societies, the Palestinian and the Israeli? This is something very important for me to say. Now, I have been saying that my appeal is not only to the international community, because alas, we do need the support of the international community, without which we have no chance, we are doomed. But my appeal is also to the Israeli society to be awake, to wake up, to realize what in our name has been done for more than a year now. Now, I will never stop. I know that I am persecuted. I've been suspended. There's a great chance I'll be suspended again, perhaps even worse. There's a violence, there's violence against people like me. I cannot walk down the street, freely anywhere in Israel. I cannot go shopping, for instance, which, by the way, that's the good side of the story.
Can I ask you, sorry, do you fear for your life?
Absolutely. I cannot walk down the streets by myself, really, absolutely. I mean, there is a violence already because, there is no police anymore in Israel. The police has turned into a private militia of the Minister of National Security, so-called, who is a bloody fascist. They act as if he owned them, the police. And of course, in addition to that, there are many armed militias waiting for the D-Day. Once Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, or anyone else from this fascist government gives the order, they will no doubt shoot demonstrators. Who knows, perhaps a day will come that the mob will invade, private homes to take people out and lynch them. That already almost happened a few months ago when a mob penetrated into no less than Israeli military bases to release soldiers who are suspected in torturing and sodomizing Palestinian detainees. And the police was not there because the minister don't want them to be there. Why shouldn't they do the same to me or to anyone else who objects the government? Time will, it's only a matter of time if it doesn't stop now. Now, going back to your question.
Well, can I ask just one more question? Because this is important. It's very important. I mean, do you see a moment will come when you feel you have to flee Israel for safety?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Some people already left, some of them because most of them, I guess, because they just don't feel like home. They don't want their children to be educated in such a system, to be, sacrificed in vain on the altar of this fascist government and the well-being of the settlers, for instance. They don't feel free. But some of them, and I know personally some of them, left Israel because they are afraid. It's already begun. It's already begun, It's not something that may happen in 1 month or 1 year. It began already. Some people left. I don't know. I cannot tell you how many. But some people left because they are afraid. Absolutely. So that's what I've been saying before. When I'm talking about Israel turning into becoming a fascist regime, I do not use those terms like fascism or genocide, very lightly. Allow me to say that as a professor at the university for many years, and you know that my PhD is from England, and I was teaching there as well for 2 years at London School of Economics. I know something about what fascism is and what genocide is, academically speaking. When I use those terms, as I said before, painfully, I use them not for political cynical reasons, but as a diagnosis, as if I was an MD who have to diagnose a patient.
But the reason I find this it's chilling on its own terms. But if we were to think about pre-World War,
I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I was saying the reason I find this so chilling, it's chilling on its own terms, is if we think of particularly pre-war anti-Semitism. Obviously, all Jewish people were affected by anti-Semitism, but there was a particular type that targeted left-wing Jews, treating them as the enemy within, as traitors to their own country. So when I hear a Jewish leftist talking about how they might have to flee Israel on the grounds that the mob might come for them, I don't know it's difficult to put into words how disturbing that is.
It is disturbing, and I've been warning of that for over a year now, but nobody wants to listen. I am suspended time and time again. That's the second time I've been suspended in the last year, because I insist in telling the truth. I'm not suspended because I was lying. Actually, I've been suspended because I'm telling the truth, and they want to hide it. But I began to say, I wanted to say, I'm going back to your question before, there are thousands of Israelis, Jewish Israelis,
Absolutely.
who feel and think more or less like me. It does not necessarily mean that they think exactly like me. I hope not, because I prefer the, heterogeneous thinking. But many people, and diversity, of course, but thousands and thousands of people, of citizens in Israel, Jewish citizens, sometimes even take the streets. But there is a fear, going on because of the violence and the threats, etc. People, have been fired from their workplaces and from their studies at the university because of participation in demonstrations, by the way, or because they tweeted or posted something not in support of violence of Hamas, perish the thought, but sympathy for the victims, for instance, or opposing the ongoing attacks on Gaza. So people are afraid, but there are hundreds of thousands, you know what, perhaps millions of Jewish in Israel who oppose the genocide, not only because they are afraid, and justly so, for the fate of the Israeli hostages, but because they know that what's going on in Gaza is unjust, is evil. There are thousands like that. We cannot generalize and think that all Israelis, Jewish Israelis, think the same. The Israeli society is very polarized. The problem is that the fascists, the racists, and I dare say, unfortunately, I must say, that there are also Nazi thugs in Israel in the streets. And those are stronger at the moment. They are fearless because they are backed by the government. So, especially in the West Bank and in Gaza Strip, but within Israel proper as well. But on the other hand, there are thousands who stand firm against them. People, Jewish Israelis, almost every day accompany Palestinian shepherds in the West Bank to protect them from the violence of the settlers and the occupation forces. And they take a risk by doing so. We cannot forget that. So there is a very good reason, on the one hand, to be very worried and very pessimistic. But on the other hand, still there is hope. And there is a reason to be optimistic, as long as there are thousands of people who oppose those crimes and do something about it, not only oppose in their living room watching the telly and cursing.
Finally, my question, I suppose a two-part question, because I think they might be linked. Certainly by looking at the history of South Africa, I think they're linked. But you mentioned the so-called international community. I mean, now with Trump in the White House, with right-wing zealots, fanatical Christian evangelicals who have a religious underpinning for their uncritical, devout, pro-Israel positioning. But I mean, if you think, for example, of the British government, what message would you have for the British government? And do you think, I mean, in terms of how this ends one day, if you have, a land which is shared on the basis of equality and justice by all who live there, be they Jewish, Palestinian, how do we end up there? Is it about not, within Israeli society, as courageous as people as you are, you're marginalized? Does this end because enough pressure is forced by the citizens of the West on their own governments to stop facilitating these crimes?
Well, I'll tell you what I told a senior official in the British government that I met a couple of weeks ago. And what I said, there were three main things. First, to respect the decision, the rule by the ICC to arrest Netanyahu and Gallant if they land in England, in Britain. This is one thing. Secondly, recognize the Palestinian state as many states around the globe in the UN did. It's time for the British government to do that too. And and third, which is more important, or it's a kind, of an overarching statement, given the former two, is that the British government, like any other government, must understand that there is a distinction between the Israeli government and the Israeli people. One who supports the Israeli government actually acts against the Israeli people. If one wants really to stand by the Israelis, one has to object the Israeli government, because the Israeli government is not only guilty in genocide and crimes against the Palestinian people, as I said in the beginning of our conversation, it is also guilty in crimes against the Israelis, not only by sacrificing knowingly more than 100 now Israeli hostages who have been dying in agony in Gaza. And Netanyahu is the one who foiled time and time again any possibility to reach a deal and release them. And not only by sending, soldiers, many of them young, people, almost youth, 18, 19, as a cannon fodder, in vain, no strategy, beyond what I said before, colonization, etc. It's not only that, they've been sacrificing the whole society of Israel, because everything this government does is either for the better for the interest of Netanyahu individually, especially vis-a-vis the trial is standing on, is standing in, and secondly, because there are bigots within the government who truly believe that the blood of human beings, Palestinians and Israelis alike, is the red carpet for the Messiah. And those who support this bigot, this fanatic government, acts against the people of Israel, let alone the Palestinians. That's not only a mistake, an error, that's a crime that history will judge.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. Your courage, your integrity, your moral clarity, as always, shine through. History is, of course, littered with examples of those who speak the truth and suffer the consequences in their own age. But history takes a very different look, and history, unless we have a very dark future, which I can't rule out, unfortunately, unless history continues to take a very dark turn, you will be vindicated. And I hope you always know that. I hope that sense of standing on the right side of history gives some strength in very difficult times. Please, for everyone listening and watching, share the video, get the message out. It's so important we stand with people like Ofer when he's taking such a courageous stand, and that his words are heard. They educate people. So share the video, press like, subscribe, leave comments. That helps get the video shared. But Ofer, what a pleasure as always. Great to speak to you.
Same here. Thank you so much.